Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. I'm Alan Sharland, creator of the communicationandconflict.com website and director of Chaos Conflict Management based in London in the UK. So I'm a mediator and have been a mediator for almost 25 years now. And so what I look at in these videos is the or kind of feedback to you who watch in these videos, the observations that I have about how people communicate and respond to conflict in both the ways that work but also the ways that don't work, so we can kind of look at the transition between the two situations that they find themselves in. So today's video is the second of 3 videos on ineffective and effective responses to conflict. So the first one, hopefully many of you will have seen, was looking at the avoidance response to conflict. So that's one of the ways in which we remain stuck in conflict, when we use an avoidance response. And today's video is about the competitive response, which is usually the more kind of obvious way in which a conflict is playing out and remains unresolved. And I'll explain more about that in a little bit. And then the third video, it will be about the ways in which we effectively resolve conflict, or the features of an effectively resolved conflict, what I call the 3 cheers for conflict, where we create learning, connection and insight. So these videos are very much looking at how our own contribution to the situation affects whether the conflict is likely to be resolved or not. A lot of looks at a lot of kind of portrayals of these things will often be about what we think the other person is doing, but obviously we have no control over that, and while we're doing that, what we tend to do is ignore our own contribution to whether a conflict is responded to effectively or not. So what I want to look at or explain to you today are the observations I have about the ways in which we tend to be competitive in response to a conflict, in ways that often perhaps people aren't even recognizing, and why that ultimately means it can never be resolved, because we're not actually looking at the problem, we're looking at the other person. But anyway, I'll go into more detail about that after this little bit of introductory music. I hope you stay with me until after that's finished, and I hope you find the rest of the video interesting. So, the competitive response to conflict, the one that never works, just like the avoidance response never works, and it will mean that if we're only adopting either the avoidance or the competitive, or both, our conflict will always remain unresolved, is basically saying, I'm right and you are wrong. And when you don't see how right I am and how wrong you are, then also it must mean that you're bad and I'm good. And I'm probably also a victim of your badness. That's not always the case, but often that's also runs alongside it. So I then start to describe how bad you are by using labels to describe you. Those labels might be abusive labels, which obviously don't really convey much of any useful information about why I think that way. Well, actually most labels don't convey that, but I might use terms like calling you an idiot or stupid, or I may say an abusive term, you're an effing W, you're a tosser, or whatever, but none of those terms are actually supporting resolution of the conflict, because I'm not wanting to hear what your perspective is, because I'm saying the fact you hold that perspective must mean there's something wrong with you, because my view is right and yours is wrong. So I'm not acknowledging that my view is right for me, but your view is right for you. And even though we might completely disagree on how we see a situation, there's no reason why yours should be wrong and mine's right. Mine's right for me and yours is right for you. But in a competitive response, I'm always saying that mine's right and yours is wrong. So it's mine's absolutely right and yours is absolutely wrong. And I've got no interest in even hearing your perspective, because in a sense, by opening to hearing it, it suggests I might not be absolutely right. I might only be subjectively right. I might only be right from my perspective, and I may not want to acknowledge that for whatever reason. Partly maybe because I don't like you, or you've said something to me that's upset me, so I want to always dismiss everything you say. So I'm not actually taking any kind of learning approach to the situation. I'm dismissing you and saying you're wrong and I'm right. And as I say, I then start using labels. And those labels might be, you're a bully. And some people who feel they're being bullied at the moment may not like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't help to resolve the situation to call someone a bully. What helps, as we'll look at more in the third video, is to explore more about what's actually happening, what the problem is, rather than to label the person. It might be that in neighbour dispute situations that I used to work in some neighbour dispute situations, people did used to be quite, abusive and verbally abusive towards each other. In some situations, even there might have been an element of violence would have happened in the situation. But in other situations, they may have tried to kind of sound courteous and polite in their kind of dismissal of the other person. So they may use phrases like saying they're not being reasonable, or they're not being rational about it. And while that's not often thought of as an abusive term, it certainly is still taking a competitive approach, because by saying they're not being reasonable, it suggests I think I'm being reasonable and they're not, or I'm being rational and they're not. And I sometimes see in chat room discussions people say, I've got this problem, but the other person's not being reasonable. And what obviously they're not recognizing is that the other person's being entirely reasonable from their perspective, but it's just not the same perspective as the person who's gone to the chat room about their problem. And that's the thing, that we will adopt a competitive approach, even perhaps sometimes where we think we're not, where we're being kind of, courteous and polite and reasonable about it. But actually what we're doing is we're dismissing the other person's point of view by implying they're not being reasonable because they don't agree with us. But that's because they've got their perspective. So I've talked before in the I statements video about the circle of perception, that where we might be looking in on a situation, and I'm looking at it from my position on the circle, and the other person's looking from their position on the circle, and we may see what we think are very different things, and we may be assuming that they see things the same as us, and we may think, well, how can you possibly say that about the problem when that's clearly not the problem, or that's not an issue? But from their point of view, it is an issue. But we then either choose to listen to their perspective, which, as I say in the third video we'll talk about, is what I call connection, or we just say, you're mad, how can you possibly be seeing that? That's clearly not the case. But we're not recognizing that that's from our perspective it's not the case, but it is from their perspective. So we then either just get into a continuous dismissal of each other's perspectives, or we learn to listen to each other and understand, or at least acknowledge that their view is different to ours, even if we don't fully understand their perspective. So in the competitive response, I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm good and you're bad. And as it progresses, we'll come up with more and more reasons why each other is bad. And as I say, you can see that on an individual situation, whether it's within families, whether it's in communities, whether it's in workplaces, that will be the way it goes. People will have kind of labels and names for people that they've fallen out with. It could be, in some situations, someone might not like their manager and say, oh, they're a little Hitler. Like they kind of think that the person's a bit of a dictator, but for whatever reason, that person might feel that that's what they need to do to be a good manager. It doesn't mean to say they might not change their mind when they hear our perspective, but all the time we're calling them names and demonizing them, they're probably not going to want to hear our perspective. They're just going to want to defend themselves against our names and labels. But ultimately, this is where it gets stuck in a competitive approach to conflict. That we use labels to demonize people. If you look at the Brexit debate that's going on at the moment, I don't know how many years hence this video may be up and whether it will have all passed by then, but much of what's going on is demonizing of anybody who voted differently to whoever the person is who's expressing a view, demonizing them in one way or another, rather than actually seeking to understand the different perspectives. But as I say, that's what we all do, so it's no surprise that's happening. It's just what we all do. It just doesn't work to resolve conflict. And the thing about the avoidance response and the competitive response is this sort of they're very interconnected, because if there's a competitive response is happening in a difficult situation, it might escalate until it gets very, very bad. Like there might be a stand-up row or abuse, and then people will then perhaps start to use the avoidance response, because the problem still hasn't been resolved, but they feel that it's better to adopt the avoidance response. But as we said as I said in the other video, the avoidance response means we're living our lives dependent on where the other person is. So we're not actually resolving it. We're having to live our lives with like a ball and chain, affecting, we can't go somewhere because the other person might be there. So we're not really living our lives very freely. But in the other direction, it can be that it starts with an avoidance approach where we kind of think, oh no, I won't say anything about this, I won't say anything about this, until it gets to a point where we're so pissed off or frustrated that something's happened that we then adopt a competitive approach, and we just kind of explode with expletives and abuse and dismissals of the other person. So the two kind of can feed into each other in one way or another, but at the end of the day, neither helps to resolve the conflict. So as I said, what I would ask you to do is think about any situation you're involved in, or that you're observing other people being involved in, and just consider to what extent you feel you're adopting a competitive response. And don't feel that there's anything I'm saying that criticizes you for that. Just know for yourself that it won't ever resolve the conflict for you to take that approach, to continually call the other person names and to demonize them. While you might temporarily think it feels better, it won't resolve it, and in time it won't even feel better, because it will still be a conflict for you. A month's time, a year's time, maybe 10 years time, you'll be worn out by it, and maybe then start to think, well, was it an effective way to just continually demonize this person and criticize them, rather than actually to acknowledge that their point of view makes sense from their perspective. And I guess as a final kind of little story about this, I want to kind of talk about someone who I often quote as an example of where you might imagine it would never be the case that someone would be open to hearing another person's perspective, but they chose to. And that was someone called Jo Berry, who's, some of you watching this video may have heard of her, and her father was killed in the what was called the Brighton bombing in 1982. I think it was October 1982. Apologies if that's wrong, but and her father was killed in a bomb planted by the IRA in a hotel in Brighton in the UK, south coast of the UK. And you might imagine that she would have enormous kind of feelings of revenge and hatred towards the IRA, but she chose quite soon after it happened to seek to understand the perspectives of the people who may have been involved in that bombing. And after the Good Friday Agreement, again, there may be things that I'm not entirely historically accurate with this, so apologies to anybody who does know, but I think it was as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, the person who planted the bomb, the person known at the time as the Brighton bomber, Pat McGee, she met with him, and their initial contact was a conversation which I think went on for 2 to 3 hours, where they just sat and talked to each other about what led to that event on that day. And she wasn't going to demonize Pat McGee. She might have felt all sorts of difficult feelings towards him, but her interest was in understanding how that came about, how it came to be that he chose to plant a bomb as a consequence of his experiences of growing up in Northern Ireland, and what led to him doing that. Now, that's not a competitive approach. That's learning, connection and insight approach to conflict. And so, sometimes people say, oh, my boss has done this and I can never speak to them and they're wrong and they're bad. But if you consider what she experienced, and yet she was still willing to listen to the perspective of the person who did that, I think it shows that it can be possible. I'm not, none of us can ever know what we feel comfortable about doing and not doing. I'm not sure I could have done that. But it does show it is possible to adopt a non-competitive, non-avoidance approach and an effective approach, even in extreme circumstances like that. So when we think about our workplace disputes, our family disputes, and our continued attempts to dismiss other people's perspectives, just know that it is possible. It may not be possible for us, but it is possible to have conversations even about very severe situations like that with other people. And the thing about Joe and Pat is they now actually do travel the world together, having dialogues in front of audiences about what led to that event, and also what meant that they held those perspectives about a shared situation, which was the conflict in Northern Ireland. Joe's obviously having come from the fact that her father was killed as a consequence of it. And so just being able to witness that dialogue, that willingness to listen to and explore the experiences, I think is a great example of why it's possible not to have to be involved in a competitive response to conflict. So I'm going to end there. That's the second of the two videos about the ineffective responses to conflict, the first being avoidance, the second being competitive. If you have any questions, please, or comments, please put them in the section below. And the next video will be about how we effectively resolve conflict, the features of an effectively resolved conflict, which I call learning, connection and insight, which I also sometimes call the 3 cheers for conflict, because they are the positive benefits that can come from experiencing and then resolving conflict, which actually we do most of the time and we don't give ourselves enough credit for. But the ways in which that conflict remains stuck are this way: the competitive response to conflict, and the avoidance response, which is on the other video. So if this was of interest and the last one was of interest, and you think the next one will be of interest, please join me for the next video as well. Thanks for watching. Bye bye. Thanks for watching and listening to this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please click the like button below to give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more in the future, please subscribe to my channel. Please also share it on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or any other social media if you think others may want to see the video. If you have any comments or questions or requests for future topics for other videos relating to communication and conflict, please put them in the comments section below. So thanks very much for watching. Have a great day, and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.